Thank you all for your generosity. Now we're going to enter into a time of meditation. I will read this first, and then we'll have some time in silence together. It's called In-Betweenness. We, you and I, are in between right now. In between what was and will be, in between who we were and who we are becoming, in between letting go and embracing, in between saying hello and goodbye. In between us, it's a thing. In between us is a time of fullness, a time of anticipation, a time of hope, a time of worry, a time of sadness. In between us is a time of waiting, waiting for news, waiting for departure, waiting for arrival, waiting for death, waiting for life. In betweenness is a time of transformation, a time of reflection, a time of action, a time of growing, a time of becoming. During this time of in-betweenness, that's a really hard word to say, of knowing and not knowing, let us enter into the silence together. Amen and blessed be. So let us now have a few moments of silence together. And then take a breath or two and come back to this space. Well, Olympia Brown has just got to be one of my favorite people. And part of the reason is that she did so much in this world, and yet nobody knows about her. I wonder how that happened. Not going to speculate, but I think you can guess. I mean, really, even in our own denomination, which celebrates these heroes from the past, you kind of just don't hear about her very much. So I'm fixing that today. And I know it's a little early for Women's History Month, but what the heck? Get a good start on it. Well, to begin with, I think in order to understand why and how she is such a hero in the UU world, you have to kind of first look at what was happening in her context. She was a 19th century woman. She was born in 1835 and she lived until 1926. So in this period of time, during her, especially her young adulthood, the Civil War happened. Then there was the post-Civil War Reconstruction, during which time this country was changing radically in ways that were both good and bad. We became much more industrialized. People started leaving the rural areas to come live in the cities where there were more opportunities. We had more immigration, and that brought different religions and cultures that really challenged the Protestant idea of one interpretation of American life. And of course, I don't need to point out the obvious, but I will anyway, that there's some sentiment on some sides of the political spectrum that we ought to go back to that, where we had a single interpretation of American life. But because we are here, they won't be able to do it, right? So, it was easy to lay the blame. There were a lot of stuff going on about the perceived moral failure because of these changes. And so there were some people who really wanted to re-exert control in people's lives. But then there was a split that came between the religious liberal thinkers and the conservatives. And so the religious liberals thought that the answer lay in a social gospel. We would probably call it social justice work now, that redeeming the social order, the way things were in our world, was more important than redeeming individual lives. And so you began to see liberal religions taking up this notion that we have to attend to our communities. We have to fix what keeps people down more than just introducing them to the idea of their personal savior. So anyway, solving these social problems was really paramount. And the conservatives thought that personal salvation was the answer. So then along comes the revival movement, the Salvation Army, and this emphasis on being saved. You know, even in the Puritan world that we had before all this got stirred up, there was no precept or tenet that said you even could be personally saved. As you recall, the Puritans were all about, it's already been decided. You can do what you want, but you can't fix this in any way, shape, or form. So anyway, that's the world that surrounded her. So she was born in Michigan in 1835, and she was the oldest of four children, and her parents were farmers, but I think that kind of categorizes them in a way that isn't entirely quite true. As a sidebar, it turns out they were the great aunt and uncle of Calvin Coolidge, who was probably one of the worst presidents next to maybe Warren Harding and obvious others that we've ever had. So I don't know if they were proud of the fact that they were his aunt and uncle. But there were people who thought two things. One, religion, and two, education were of the utmost importance. They even built a school on their property and hired a teacher so that kids from the surrounding area could get an education. And so it doesn't seem to be surprising that Olympia went to high school and graduated. And then, of course, she wanted to go to college. Remember, this is like 1850 now. She started at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, but the restrictions were too severe. And they had like a list of 40 rules of behavior that you had to follow. Her parents had started a literary society at Mount Holyoke, and they closed it, stopped it. And there were lots and lots of religious restrictions. So you can imagine that a young woman who had been brought up in these liberal ideas of religion and education was not going to do well there. So she got out of there about as soon as she could. And then she went to Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. Anybody ever been to Yellow Springs? Antioch College still exists, although it went through a period where it closed. Of course, what we remember most about Yellow Springs is the ice cream. So the big dairy outside of town, you got to go. Anyway, Antioch was marginally better. And I think when she got there, she kind of realized that she was going to have to play at a different level. She needed to raise her standards and work harder. And that was a good thing, even though Antioch was still pretty limiting for women. One of the things that's mentioned in a lot of the biographical material that I found said that the male students were expected to memorize their speeches, but the women were not. And so she took that as a personal challenge, and then she did it anyway. So you can see two inklings of the things that she was going to need to use in the future, and that is knowing what she was capable of and being unafraid to work for it. And as a point of reference, when she finally became a minister, she never used notes when she preached. She did it all from her memory. But she did want to be a minister, so she did what everybody does. She applied to a bazillion schools, whatever there was available, and they all turned her down, including the Unitarian Universalist Meadville Seminary and Oberlin. I mean, come on, simply because she was a woman. So finally, she was kind of half-heartedly accepted at the theological school at St. Lawrence University, which is in the Northlands of New York. The president of that university didn't think that women could or should be ministers, so he wrote her an acceptance letter that he was sure was going to discourage her. But he clearly did not know who he was dealing with, so when she showed up, they weren't expecting her. And the president was confused to see her. So she said, according to her autobiography, she said to him, "Your discouragement was my encouragement." So she brought with her to this school experience her belief that freedom of religious thought and a liberal church would supply the groundwork for all other freedoms. So she already had this connection with what liberal religious thought could do in the wider community. Now, I have to say that according to what's been written about this, she certainly endured what we would now call bullying, and pretty severe. When she did sermons, they were dismissed as not good enough. She had at that time a high-pitched voice, and the male students would gather under her bedroom window at night and speak in this falsetto voice and ridicule her for that. So she, of course, took that as a challenge, and she enrolled herself in a voice school. So she learned how to speak at a lower pitch and with more power. So it was really hard for her, as smart as she was, to achieve this goal of ministry. But in a way that kind of showed who she was, she overcame all these obstacles with a lot of optimism, courage, and determination. Despite the fact that she got opposition from all sides. She got it from the students, she got it from the faculty, and in a way that I can't even begin to understand, the wives of the faculty. They were just determined that she wasn't going to make it. She was equally determined that she was, and so she did. So she completed her coursework in 1863. So remember, now we're in the middle of the Civil War. But her faculty refused to ordain her. So instead, what she did was what a lot of ministers did then. She became a kind of a circuit rider. And she preached at several churches that were in Vermont for about a year. And then she appealed her case to the Universalist Council of New York, which was in a town called Malone. So interestingly, one member of this council had heard her preach and was quite impressed with her ability to do that. And he supported her. And then very surprisingly, the council agreed to ordain her. So this is important because she was the first woman to be ordained by a national denomination. There had been other women who had been ordained at individual churches. And one of them was one of her mentors. So there's always a little bit of argument about whether she was the first woman to be ordained, but she was the first woman to be ordained at that higher level. And you would think, well, that's it then. Life's going to just flow on. No, doesn't mean she was done with difficulties. She would never have a career in a big church because those jobs were only for men. So that left her all the little churches, the ones in trouble financially or the ones that were being pulled apart by dissension in the congregations. She pastored churches in Massachusetts and Connecticut from 1864 to 1878. And a lot of times she got these churches over the reluctance of the parishioners to even have a woman minister. But here's the thing, she was never an ordinary minister. She was a very powerful preacher, and she had been compared in her time to Henry Ward Beecher, who was acknowledged as probably the best preacher in the country. She was organized, she was optimistic. She always had a vision of how a church could expand its vision to be a positive force in the community, and she loved her work. So there's all that. Here's the beginning of her career. And I'll say more about this later, but she took these little churches that were in trouble and she got them back into shape. You know, she knew how to do that work. But then there was something else happening kind of at the same time. She got involved in the women's rights movement and she worked with Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone. So in 1867, there was a movement afoot in my home state to support a suffrage women's suffrage amendment. Well, actually, it was a vote to women and African Americans. So Lucy Stone, who was a big figure in the suffragist movement, her husband, Henry Blackwell, told Olympia that he had made all of the arrangements. Now, I just say right now, that was a big old lie. He hadn't done anything. So clearly 19th century men and women had different definitions of arrangements. So when she arrived, she had to arrange all of her travel. She had to find a place to stay. She had to manage the advertisement for her speeches, find places to give them, and deal with a constant stream of hostile jerks who wanted to discredit her. Now, add to that, as if that's not enough, I know this well, this is summer in Kansas, which meant 100-degree temperatures and 40-mile-an-hour winds, all while wearing 19th century women's clothing. I mean, and she gave 300 speeches that summer. the woman was unstoppable. I mean, I don't even know how she did that, but she did. But despite all of her work, in spite of all that work, the amendment didn't pass, which was also a common finding with suffrage movements at the state level, except of course in Wyoming. Go figure that. So that was a very big disappointment to her, but Susan B. Anthony thought she'd done a great job. So a year after she came back from Kansas, she started the New England Women's Suffrage Association, and it was the first organization formed solely for the purpose of supporting votes for women. As she said, the old anti-slavery workers, in winning their victory, felt that all other victories were comprised in that, and I saw that although they favored women's suffrage, they would do nothing for it unless we could make our reform a clear-cut, separate, and single question. I think she was being kind there. It was largely true that a lot of the people in the suffrage movement worked tirelessly to end slavery. They were very involved with the abolitionist movement. But when it came time for the abolitionists to help with women's suffrage, they couldn't be bothered. That was true across the country. So in the meantime, she has a church in Connecticut that she's preaching at. And she met and married John Henry Willis in 1873. And she kept her own name. Huh. Who knew? It's kind of funny because her mother didn't want her to marry. She thought it would ruin her career, but she did anyway. But John Henry turned out to be the perfect partner for her. He shared her work and he could move his employment to go with her wherever she needed to go. They had 2 children. And while she was pregnant with her first, a faction in the church wanted to get rid of her because, she was pregnant. Never mind that she had resuscitated this failing congregation. So she stuck that out for a while, but in 1874, she decided to resign. The family stayed in Connecticut for 2 more years and had their second child. But she had such a strong calling to the ministry that she applied to Racine, Wisconsin, the Universalist church there. So another church that was in dire straits at the time. Again, she took on a church abandoned by men. In my gripey way, I assume they all went on to bigger and more prosperous churches. I'm pretty sure that's where the Peter Principle was invented. But she did what she was best at. With competence, dedication, and practical skill, she brought that church back from the dead. She not only built the congregation, she made the church into a learning center for the community. Sorry, I've got to wipe my nose for some reason. I hope that doesn't show up on the tape. It will. So Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Julia Ward Howe, and a lot of other renowned people at the time spoke at her church. So she was also very good at bringing people in to add more perspectives. So she stayed there for 11 years, but something else was kind of stirring in her, and she thought it was time for a change. So from that time on, she maintained a kind of a part-time ministry in several of these small churches, but she became a women's rights activist, and she jumped right into that state and national level of the work. And you can see that over these years, she had been building all of these skills that when it came time to apply them to this work, she already had what she needed to be effective. She worked really hard to get a law passed in Wisconsin to allow women to vote. But in the state Supreme Court, they decided they were going to limit those votes to school elections. So it was kind of a plus minus on that. She started a paper about women's suffrage that she wrote for and published until 1917. And it was a really good source of information to help women who were working for the vote. She led the Wisconsin Suffrage Association and was vice president of the National Women's Suffrage Association. So along with that, she worked continuously to get more women into colleges and universities. She traveled a lot, and she was really lucky to have a partner and a mother who could care for the family while she was gone. So you can see childcare was an issue even then, maybe even more so. But by the 1890s, she kind of thought that the movement was stalling out. She didn't think much of the leadership of Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Shaw. She thought they weren't making enough progress toward a a constitutional amendment because she thought that's what it would take. There wasn't enough fire in the cause for her, and she thought they were too focused at trying to get all of these individual states to do these amendments. Now you have to remember, the woman is 78 years old now in the 19th century. So Alice Paul and Lucy Barnes started the Women's Party, and action was the name of the game for them. So they organized vigils and demonstrations to stir up support. And when she was asked to be a charter member of the party, her reply was, "I belonged to this party before I was born." So here we are, 78, 79 years old. She demonstrated, she confronted police, she dealt with hecklers. And this is my favorite thing. Woodrow Wilson denied support for the amendment. He was just against it. She burned his speeches on the lawn of the White House. So that was pretty dangerous work. And if you recall, there were women who were arrested and essentially tortured for their work in the suffrage movement. So it took a certain kind of courage to be willing to take that kind of punishment. And of course, even after Congress passed the amendment, it still had to be ratified by the states. So back she went onto the campaign trail. So after all of this work, finally, when the amendment was ratified, she was one of the very few original suffragists who were still alive. She cast her first presidential vote when she was 85 years old. Yay, Olympia. She spoke with her Racine church in 1920 about all of the changes she'd experienced in what would be her last sermon. So this is what she said. "The grandest thing has been the lifting up of the gates and the opening of the doors to the women of America, giving liberty to 27 million women, thus opening to them a new and larger life and a higher ideal. The foundation of democracy is the realization that every human being is a child of God, entitled to the opportunities of life, worthy of respect, and requiring an atmosphere of justice and liberty for his development. The greatness of men, the grand capabilities of women, attest the worth of the human being fashioned in the image of God." So it's not hard to see how some of our principles were formed in part by Olympia Brown and her work. So you'd think, well, maybe at 85, she would just retire. Oh no, that is not the case. She wasn't finished yet. She spent the rest of her life working for world peace as an original member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, as well as the ACLU and the League of Women Voters. She sought to take hold somewhere of the world's work and win for women. Oh, this is Lucretia Ellinger. Sorry, I have to attribute that properly. So after she died, her friend Lucretia Ellinger said this of her. "She sought to take hold somewhere of the world's work and win for women some larger recognition than had yet been accorded them. Her feet have trodden many thorny paths, and she has ever stood in the front of the battle for equal rights and opportunities for women." So I don't know about you, but knowing about Olympia Brown makes me really proud to be a Universalist Unitarian. And I think she is the perfect way for us to kind of ease our way into the Women's History Month when it comes. So blessed be and amen. Closing words. Oh, I forgot to even talk about her photographs. I think you can look at her. I mean, doesn't she look determined in both of those pictures? It's like, get out of my way. I got work to do here. So we can take a lot of oomph from Olympia Brown. All right, for our closing words. Friends, thank you for your witness to all that exists on the margins. Thank you for your commitment to hold yourselves and one another in great and steadfast love. Moving forward from this space, may we continue to nurture spiritual growth. May we continue to travel along the winding pathway to healing from whatever brokenness we individually and collectively hold, knowing that we do not journey this path alone. So thank you all. And now it's time to sing ourselves downstairs for what comes next.